made to you so special? Nothing. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn.
Okay, guys, Frank Stout, just a guy from Brooklyn. I'm here to give you a brand new ranking, something really, really special, something that I really hold dear to my heart. I want to give you the top 20 Saturday morning cartoons. Before we just jump in, like I always love to do, I got to give you my two rules. Rule number one, spoilers. I guess there might be some spoilers in these cartoons. Who knows? So I'm going to give you like a medium spoiler warning on this one. Rule number two is, as always, I got to say this. This is a favorites list, not a best list. My honorable mention is Schoolhouse Rock. No list about Saturday morning cartoons would be complete without Schoolhouse Rock, which is why I had to include this. Came out in 1973, and these were like educational shorts that they put between the cartoons while you're watching your Saturday morning cartoons. And they just had lots of like really catchy songs and jingles. Melting Pot was one, which was basically learning about how, you know, America is all these different cultures mixed into this big pot. You had Conjunction Junction, which this, you know, the song, obviously it teaches you English with words, but the song, Conjunction Junction, what's your function? It was so cool. And then, of course, I'm Just a Bill. I'm Just a Bill was just so fun, with the little bill hanging outside and explains how bills become laws and everything. And you ask any older person out there on the street about Schoolhouse Rock, they're going to give you their favorites. They might even sing to you their favorites. Coming in at number 20 is Gem. Came out in 1985, and it was truly, truly, truly outrageous. It was a cartoon about like a female rock band. Totally honest with you, this wasn't my cup of tea, but because this was sandwiched in between two shows that I really loved, I had to watch it. I ended up watching every single episode because you had your favorite show in the beginning, then Gem, and then your third show. So I had like the enemy evil rock band, the Misfits. It was always kind of silly. Coming in at number 19 is Dragon's Lair. Now, those of you who watch Stranger Things might have noticed that they did do a little short where the kids were playing Dragon's Lair. It was a very, very famous video game, arcade game, where, you know, it was made by an artist, Don Bluth, very famous artist who left Disney at one point and started doing his own stuff. And he did this video game named Dragon's Lair, which took the video game industry by storm when it came out because it was a Laserdisc game. But it was all about this knight, you know, you play this knight who tries to save a princess. Real simple, from a dragon. The thing about the show was when it came out, you know, everybody got excited because they loved the video game. Unfortunately, the artwork just was nothing near what Don Bluth did. Couldn't you find somebody at least to kind of do a similar artwork to Don Bluth? This stuff just looked like crap. Episodes were like really generic and very unimportant, and it really didn't capture the spirit of the video game. Coming in at number 18 is Herculoids. Came out in 1967. It's the oldest show I have on this list. Herculoids was part of Hanna-Barbera. If you don't know, Hanna-Barbera used to dominate cartoons back in like the 60s and 70s. A lot of your favorite cartoons, Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, I could go on and on and on. They were all Hanna-Barbera. And Hanna-Barbera was so big and had made so many cartoons back then that they basically like had their own universe. And the thing is, they weren't afraid to play around with that. They actually came up with this thing called the Wacky Races, where they had all the cartoon characters would join up and race in these like kooky vehicles. The Herculoids, though, was more like a weird sci-fi sword and sorcery kind of thing. It's like a group of humans grouped up with these like beasts, and these beasts each have their own like powers and abilities. You have like this ape made out of rock. You have a dragon that spits some type of laser out. You have these like blob kind of character that can split up into different blobs and stuff. Really cool. It was something I just really looked forward to watching. Coming in at number 17 is Black Star. Now, some of you have probably never heard of Black Star, and if you were to see it, you'd be like, oh my God, this is like the only He-Man ripoff, right? Guess what? It came out like many years before He-Man. It's kind of like a Buck Rogers kind of a situation where he's like coming from space, he lands, and he's like with these like Hobbit characters. But the coolest thing about this show was the fact that there was this really, really powerful sword, and they don't really show how it happened, at least from what I remember, but the sword split in half. And so the evil villain had half the sword, and Black Star had his half of the sword. And so they would go at it. Coming in at number 16 is a show called Captain N, the Game Master. Came out in 1989. And this was like the cartoon they made for the Nintendo crowd. Basically, they had all your favorite characters from Nintendo that were made by Nintendo. You had like the hero from Castlevania. You had Kid Icarus. And then on like the villain side, you had Metroid. You had Donkey Kong. It was really fun. These were just really fun. Unfortunately, this show it didn't run for too long. I think it might have only lasted like maybe a season or two. Coming in at number 15 is a special one for me. It's called, and get ready for this, The Completely Mental Misadventures of Ed Grimley. Came out in 1988. Now, this is the only show on my list that is based on an SNL skit, and the star of it was Martin Short. If you've ever seen the cartoon, you know how fun it is. It's really, really fun. But the thing about Ed Grimley was, obviously, he was like a very silly character, the way he talked and everything. But for me, what did it was like, he had this dance. It kind of reminds me of like Elaine from Seinfeld and her wacky dance. And the killer is, I actually was pretty good. I probably am not too great at doing it now. This is a true story. Me and my friends went out to a big Sweet 16 in Sunset Park on 4th Avenue. You know, DJ, and we had really great music playing, club music, hip hop, and everything. And me and a few friends, there was only like 2 or 3 of us. And we were like, fuck that. We're doing the Ed Grimley dance. And we did it. And the people around us were looking at us for the first few minutes like we were nuts. But then, slowly but surely, people started to join us. People that we didn't even know were joining us. And the next thing you know, in the next like 4 or 5 minutes, almost everybody on the dance floor was doing the Ed Grimley dance. Coming in at number 14 is He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Now, you guys are probably saying, damn, he got that at 14? That was such a really popular show and big toy line and everything, right? I gotta say, I never owned a He-Man toy. I was never big on He-Man as far as toys was concerned. I was always like that kid trying to get that next Transformer or G.I. Joe figure. I never was really big on He-Man. But I must admit, the show had an impact on me. Why? Because it was on all day, every day. Forget about Saturdays. Yeah, it was on Saturdays, probably on Sundays, and it was on every morning before you went to school. And it was on every afternoon. For me, I had a thing for Skeletor. Skeletor was like this. They didn't make him, because this is a kid's show, they didn't make Skeletor to be kind of intimidating in any way. They made him more wacky and cheesy. So the voice he used to do and the laugh, I just loved it. I have the power. Anybody who's ever watched the show has spit out, I have the power. I have screamed out, I have the power many, many times, including some very interesting situations. Coming in at number 13 is Beetlejuice. Came out in 1989. Obviously, it's made based on the hit movie. This is definitely the funniest show on my list. This, even though this was a cartoon and I was getting quite up in age at this point, I found this show to be hilarious. And even though they couldn't get Michael Keaton and all the great stars from the movie, whoever did the voice acting did a pretty damn good job. And whoever did the writing, the comedy was on point. This was always one of those shows that even if I wasn't watching television and somebody had this out in the background, I would pay mind to it because it was that good. And the artwork was also really good because it really worked with the tone of that movie, that kind of horror comedy tone. Coming in at number 12 is Battle of the Planets, also known as G-Force, also known as Gatchaman in Japan. It debuted here in the States in 1978, so it's one of the more older shows. But I will tell you, this is like the granddaddy because shows like Voltron, Power Rangers, they really owe it to this show. This show did all that stuff first. And what it was like this super team of like almost like ninja style characters, but they wore these kind of super bird outfits with like beaks. They actually had their capes would give them the ability to glide and fly. And so it gave them like almost bird-like abilities. The really cool thing was they flew this spaceship, but the coolest feature that the spaceship had that it literally would catch fire and become like the fiery phoenix. Like it literally was called that. They did do a live action movie in Japan. I don't know how successful it was. It looked a little weird. I got to see the trailer. I don't think it did too good because they never even bothered to try to, dub it or bring it over here to the States. Coming in at number 11 is Thundar the Barbarian. Came out in 1980. This is the only show that had the balls to take place in like a post-apocalyptic setting. Like the Earth and Moon had like crashed into each other or whatever, and all types of weird stuff was going on, and it was very sword and sorcery, but with like a kind of a sci-fi mix. But what I didn't realize at the time when I was a kid, and I would watch it later, I would see it on YouTube or something later, was that this was a little bit of a Star Wars ripoff. I mean, the main character used a laser sword, and his sidekick, one of his sidekicks, was literally a monster that looked like a Wookiee. I mean, he literally had Chewbacca fighting with him.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Nutritious dishes, like fill a bowl with ice cubes and add raw cauliflower. Stuff celery with cheese and let it chill for half an hour. Add carrot sticks and olives and any other knickknacks. Then keep this by the TV set for when you want those quick snacks. Well,
but while I'm waiting, could you make me a banana?
Okay, you're a banana.
Kicking off my top 10 is the Silverhawks. This came out in 1986. And it was one of two variations of the Thundercats. I thought it was really, really, really cool because it had like an outer space, kind of a police setting. The Silverhawks were like almost like android characters, but what was really cool was they were like metallic and they would shoot blasters like out of their shoulders, which is just something I never saw. I like the way they moved. They had this like cowboy character who used to like play the guitar and use the guitar as a weapon. I just loved everything about it. Even the villains look really badass in this. Like, and it was like almost like a Jabba the Hutt, almost like mafia type bad guys in space that the Silverhawks would fight. So coming in at number 9 is the Bionic 6. It came out in 1987, but I don't think I got to see it at that time. I think I ended up seeing it maybe a couple of years later on like rerun episodes. But this was definitely one of the last cartoon shows that I was watching. One of the things that stood out for me from this show is the artwork. Whoever did the artwork for this show, I mean, this is some of the best. I'm not going to call it the best artwork, but this was definitely some of the best artwork I've ever seen in a TV cartoon. My man Dom from the Fast and the Furious would definitely be his favorite, because for this one,
I don't have friends. I got family.
I'm not sure if they're family by blood, because they have a Chinese son and an African American son, and they're very mixed, family. And but they were all bionic, and they used their superpowers to fight evil, whatever. Coming in at number 8 is Mask. It came out in 1986, and please do not confuse this with the Jim Carrey mask. This was different. This was basically like a variation of Transformers, where instead of vehicles and things combining and turning into robots, these were more like vehicles that turned into other vehicles. And the people who drove them, they had these special masks with that each gave them like particular abilities. This is one that really stuck with me. It really had a great like 80s intro song that always kind of like was very catchy. Coming in at number 7 is G.I. Joe. Came out in 1983. This was the show that introduced me into G.I. Joe. And it was definitely a huge competition for Star Wars, because Star Wars, they were like the king when it came to collecting toys, and they probably still are. But G.I. Joe gave them a run for their money. Like, G.I. Joe was just pumping out figure after figure, and each figure had like their own dossier and their own specialty, and they were colorful and they were different. Then they came out with vehicles. A lot of these shows didn't really have like a full ending per se. Like, they just would go on, and the next thing you know, the show was gone. But G.I. Joe for me had like, a perfect ending. They came out with G.I. Joe the movie. And it wasn't one of those movies that came out in theater. I think it was direct to video. But I remember grabbing it, and the minute I saw it in my local video store, I snatched it up, and I really enjoyed it. It gave like an origin to Cobra, a fun movie to end a great show. Coming in at number 6 is the Super Friends. Came out in 1973. And let me tell you something, of all the shows, this probably is the one that ran the longest. I mean, this show was just going on year after year after year. But they would trick you. They tricked us children at that time, because what they would do is they would change the title. So you would have Super Friends. Then you would have the all new Super Friends Hour. Then you would have Challenger the Super Friends, World's Greatest Super Friends. They just would play on the title, but and there were certain differences, but it was all Super Friends. And since I didn't collect DC Comics, I was always a Marvel kid. This was basically my education into DC. Whoever was writing for these shows, they got weird at times, and things would really be interesting. 2 episodes in particular that I can remember that really stood out. One of them was this weird, like, Lord of the Rings type of episode where it involved the Wonder Twins. No, not those Wonder Twins. Those Wonder Twins. And the Wonder Twins went into like a cave, and they found these hobbit creatures, and the hobbit creatures were being enslaved by this evil wizard named Malhavik. The little monkey character, Gleek, he goes to the Super Friends, let them know that the Wonder Twins are in danger, and when they come, Malhavik puts a spell on all the Super Friends, turns them all into hobbit characters, and the entire episode is them trying to escape. It was really dark. It took place in like a cave. It was so like unsettling, as a kid watching this. And another episode which really stuck out for me, and it was basically like a dark universe episode thing with Superman. Somehow I remember he flies over a volcano and it erupts, and the next thing you know, evil Superman is in the good universe, and good Superman is in the evil universe and doesn't realize it. Coming in at number 5 is Voltron, Defender of the Universe, otherwise known as Beast King Go Lion in Japan. Came out here in the States in 1984. And at that time, kids had like Voltron fever. Basically, a super team very similar to Power Rangers. Whenever I would babysit somebody, they would force me to watch Power Rangers, and I would sit there and be like, "Yo, this is a fucking ripoff of Voltron. What the hell's going on here? Did they rip off Voltron? Is somebody gonna get sued?" But the coolest thing about Voltron was they rode these giant, robot lions, and the lions were cool. They were really badass. And then they would form Voltron, which is this big super robot. And at the end of each episode, he would pull out his big ass sword, chop down the Roe Beast, which is bad guys. And the show was a little repetitive, but since I was so young, I just wanted to see them form. There were two other versions of Voltron, one involving ships. I don't even remember the third one. And then they did do a remake on Netflix at one point. I did not get to see that, but I have heard good things. Maybe. Coming in at number 4 is the Thundercats. Came out in 1985. In my opinion, this is the show with the best animation. I thought the artwork on this was just next level, especially for something mid 80s. Just a combination of so much fantasy type elements. Took place on another planet. Lion-O, the head Thundercat, he had, he was the leader, but he had his age has increased in the way that when they landed, and so he was basically the mind of a child in the body of a grown ass man. So there was always that kind of aspect to him. One of the things that always made me chuckle a little bit was during the origin episodes, the you know the Thundercats were kind of naked, so I always found that kind of weird. And then you add the fact that like there's no way to get around this. I was a kid and I was a dumb kid, and yes, I had kind of a crush on Chitara.
I knew you were a vile, disgusting degenerate with bestiality. This goes beyond my wildest dreams.
Yeah, well, I like to stretch myself on occasion.
Coming in at number 3 is the Transformers. Came out in 1984. This is very, very high on my list for so many different reasons. Reason number 1, I collected the toys. As when the show came out, it gave you like that origin story, let you know who the good guys were, who the bad guys were. A little bit of New York history with this show. Unfortunately, there was a New York City gang that came out in the mid to late 80s, and they called themselves the Decepticons. And I'm not going to lie to you, they wreaked havoc on the New York City streets in all boroughs. They were causing all types of trouble. They made the papers. I remember they even had like a female gang called the Deceptinettes. I'll never forget that. One of the great things about Transformers, the cartoon, was that it was like an ongoing story. And then eventually in 86, they came out with Transformers, the movie. And I remember literally like running to the theater to see this. In the cartoon, none of these robots would ever actually die or anything. But in the movie, these robots were getting offed left and right in like almost like a bloody fashion. And I walked out of the theater just totally shocked, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, only to find out later that it was like a marketing ploy so that they killed off all these robots so this way they can introduce a whole bunch of new robots for you to go and buy at the toy store. The old okey doke on me, but it worked. Like I literally did. Yes, Michael Bay came out with I don't know how many Transformers live action movies now. I'll be kind and say that I did enjoy the first one. I don't really care for anything else. Some of my favorite Transformers. Well, I would say out of the good guys, obviously you had Optimus Prime. One of the things I didn't realize at the time was, Optimus Prime was a very like John Wayne type character. He was their leader and he was like that tough guy, but he kind of had that John Wayne kind of presence. And I didn't make the connection at the time, but the guy who voiced him mentioned that and I was like, "Oh my god." It like totally I connected the dot right there. I was never really a big Megatron guy. I like Starscream because he was like that second in command, kind of sneaky guy who was always trying to take Megatron's job and be the leader. They did have a female character which came out in the movie named Arcee, and I thought she was like the sexiest robot I've ever seen in my life. But maybe after talking about Chitara, I shouldn't even mention that, right? And my runner-up coming in at number 2 is Dungeons and Dragons. Came out in 1983. This was a really big deal for me because I used to actually play Dungeons and Dragons, the role-playing game with my friends. Yes, with the 20-sided die. This show was pretty innovative. It was about a group of teenagers who hop on this roller coaster Dungeons and Dragons ride, and they get sucked into the Dungeons and Dragons world, and they immediately get attacked. And of course, Dungeon Master shows up, and he gives each of them a special item or weapon, and he gives them their roles, just like the role you would have in the game. So you would have barbarian, thief, ranger, acrobat. The whole show was them trying to make it back home. Very Gilligan's Island kind of style. I love the show so much, and they keep coming out with Dungeons and Dragons movies. Unfortunately, none of them are based on the cartoon, and it frustrates the shit out of me. I don't know what country it was, but in a particular country, they came out with a commercial where they had live action characters of the cartoon, and it was like a car commercial. It was very odd choice, but it got me hyped because they looked like the characters from the show. So to tease me even more, the new movie that just came out, there's this scene involving a maze, and they literally teased the shit out of me by putting the cartoon characters just off in the distance, like in a blink and you'll miss it type Easter egg situation. And then when the main characters from the movie enter the maze, they kind of run into them here and there, and they show them literally for like a split second. And I was like, oh my God. Like I jumped out of, I was like, oh my God, that's them. And my number one Saturday morning cartoon of all time is Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Came out in 1981. Do not confuse this with the older Spider-Man cartoon, which had the very catchy Spider-Man. But that's not this. This is an 80s based show where he teamed up with Iceman from the X-Men and Firestar. This was basically the MCU of the 80s for us 80s kids. I mean, you had episodes with Captain America. You had episodes with Namor. It totally blew my mind when I saw the X-Men in like 3 separate episodes. I could not believe it. They even had an episode with the original X-Men team before Beast turned blue and everything. I lost my shit, which I collected Marvel Comics, and I followed all those stories in the comics to see it in a cartoon. And the irony is, for me, was that at that time in the 80s, watching these cartoons and just loving every single second was the fact that I dreamed of one day all this stuff being live action. Disney Plus does have every single episode. If you don't know, if you're curious, if you've never seen it, get nostalgic. I reminisce about watching these shows and everything. And I also think about how, like, Unfortunately, Saturday morning cartoons kind of died out. They're not really a thing anymore. And I feel like, I don't know, we've kind of lost something. We were inspired by these shows. These shows made us want to be heroes. They made us want to be better people. They educated us from the city that never sleeps, from the BK.
See my face in lights, saw my name on marquees, found down on Broadway. Even if it ain't all it seems, I got a pocket full of dreams, baby. I'm from New York, concrete jungle where dreams